In this video, we are going to learn about render props. So render props is a pattern which is used for sharing code between various components. Now you might remember that we already saw a pattern called hierarchical components, which is also used to share code among components. But this is another pattern similar to that of hierarchical components, but this has a slightly different syntax. So let's firstly get started with the pattern which was there in higher order components. Then we will get back to render props. So in higher order components, we saw that let's say we want to share some code. So let's say our code is adding some border and having some additional state, and if you apply that, then some sort of border comes. So right now you can see that if I don't apply this, then it will plain and simple hello world. However, if I apply that higher order component on this component, then that additional piece of code, shared code, will be applied to this component, and now it works like this, that the border and additional state which was there, that is added to this component. Okay, so this is what it is, which we already discussed in higher order components. Now let's try to do exactly the same thing with render props. So as we discussed, the like higher order components, render props is also used to share code. Okay, so what is the difference? The difference is that if you see carefully, then this is actual component, core component, and then uh, we are essentially sharing the code by adding this piece of code, which this with border, which is essentially higher order component. When we wrap our core component with this thing, then that shared code is applied, isn't it? So here let's say hello world is there, and here hello there is there. Then the core component is this thing which is simply rendering the div with that prop whatever is passed. So hello world and hello there is there. If I apply that shared piece of code by wrapping it with a higher order component, then that piece of shared code is applied to at both places, here also, here also. Okay, and we can wrap this obviously around other components also. So right now I'm just applying it on the same component, but you can definitely have a separate component, and that other component is wrapped with border, rather than wrapping again div1 only and reusing it. Okay, so that is fine. Now just keep things simple, just have only one component which is sharing the logic. Now what we do in render props is that we flip the mechanism like this. If you think, then my div1 is the core component, and the shared logic is inserted by, the shared code is inserted by this higher order component. Okay, what if the whole shared component, the whole shared code is inside a component, and then the thing which we are trying to the core thing is specifically inserted and told by us that what is this core thing, and the whole component is the shared thing itself. So that would be better by an example. So let's firstly let's simplify this HOC for a bit. Let's take this whole thing and just keep it at some other place. Okay, and now there is no state, so this should be gone. So yeah, and we will reuse it at some point later, but right now we are not using some additional state, we are just wrapping the thing with border. Okay, so you can see that when I'm applying this higher order component, then border is applied. Okay, if that is not there, then the border is not there. When I apply this higher order component, then this border is applied. Okay, now we are trying to do the same thing with render props. So in render props, what we do is that rather than wrapping this around, our main component is the shared logic and shared code itself, which means that the whole thing, let's call it my div, okay, and everything we will come back to here what to do about it, but the whole component itself contains the shared code, and then whatever customized thing which we want to render, that thing will be passed as a prop to this my div. Okay, so right now these two things are not needed, okay, because this was the pattern of hierarchical component. But rather than doing something like this, what we are going to do is that we are going to do something like this. So let's see, still we will pass this prop, okay, but right now when this thing will be rendered, then you can see that just there will be just plain border, but there is no content, right, because I have not written anything here. Okay, so what should be rendered here? So you can understand that it is missing, right? If I write ASDF, then that ASDF is coming here, right? But obviously I don't want to write any random thing. I want to write the hello world inside this. Okay, so what we do is that we pass an additional prop. And you can name that anything, but just for convention we can name it render, okay, because it is called render prop. Now what it does is that in this prop you pass a function, and that function tells what to render inside this component. Okay, so what you are doing is that you are essentially passing a function, and that function returns some React element. Okay, so what you can do that you can take something like this and put it here. Okay, so let's look at it again. There is a component, okay, and that component itself contains the whole shared code. So later we will add, let's say, state also, but the whole thing, whatever we want to share, that itself is the component, and then whatever is the customization, that thing we are passing it as a prop, and that prop is called render prop when that prop is a function which returns some JSX element, and that we will use here. So how we can use here? So that prop name is render. Okay, then I can instead of this I can simply use something like this dot props dot render, and this is a function, isn't it? So this dot props dot render, this thing is a function. When I call that function, then this thing will be returned. Okay, now what is this props.text? Like just in this component there is nothing like this props.text, right? So what we can do is that simply we can use text, and we can pass this text as a inside the function, and that text will be available from here as this dot props dot text. Okay, and now you can see that the same thing is happening. So let's rewind again. If you hide this, means, let's say whatever you are writing here, if you see carefully, then that thing is being printed here, right? In this case, this thing is a variable which is passed as an argument of this function. When this dot props dot render is called with this thing, this dot props dot text, then whatever text prop is passed to this component, which means hello world is passed, that hello world is essentially passed to the render function, and then that text is now hello world, and then that thing is available here, and that's why this thing is having a border, because now essentially my div is rendered which is having a border. Now you might think that, yeah, I am not reusing this text anywhere else in this component, right? So you might want to directly pass it also, so that is also fine. I'm just showing you that you can pass it as an argument also, but something like this is also perfectly fine. And now in this case you don't need this argument, so obviously this can be called without an argument. Okay, and then you can see that this works. And again, what do you mean by sharing of logic? Now we don't need this, so this was the earlier way. You mean by what do you mean by sharing the logic? Which means that if again you want to reuse this, then you can reuse this with something else, and the whole thing will be rendered again. The whole logic is shared between these two renders, but the thing which we want to change, so whatever is shared code like border, or let's say state also we will add later, and all those things are shared, but whatever things we want to change, exactly that thing we are passing it here, okay, in this function. And then in the render prop, whatever you are passing, that how do you use, that is up to the component itself. So here we use like this. Now it's just what it is, just returning a React element, so you can simply put it here, right? Anything what you want. So let's say I want x, I want to write x, I want to write y. So everything is fine. Whatever you write, that thing will be shared across all the places where it is used. Okay. Next thing is that this name render is like, it can be anything. It's just a convention that in render props name generally is kept render, but then let's say I use ABC prop rather than render prop, then just here you have to use ABC, that's it. And then you can see that it works exactly the same way. Let's keep it render only. Yeah. Now this is fine, but now let's also use this piece of code which was like shared state, isn't it? So let's use that here. Okay, so not a shared state, shared logic which uses state, which means that now whenever I want to use this my div at these two places, wherever, then at these two places I'm also interested in putting let's say this counter also. Okay, so I can have this dot state dot counter count. Okay, and then you can see that at both places that thing is used. Just I can put a space here. Okay, so you can see that the state is also shared. So this much is clear that now everything works perfectly like before, like in hierarchical component. It's just the difference is that now this is not some HOC part of like HOC. This is a separate component in itself, and the whole shared logic is in another component itself. And then we like insert specific customized JSX in the way which we want, and then that specific JSX is being used in whatever way you want to use inside the main component, which essentially contains the shared code. Next, what I can do is that it's not that let's say you can share a few more things. So right now you can see that this arguments passed is empty, but you can do something like this small thing. So let's say you can directly take this, okay, and then pass it here. Okay, and then rather than doing this thing here, I am doing the same thing here. Okay, so I can do something like this where I can use that count. So what is this? Essentially this thing is let's say the variable is count, and then I can simply use that count here. Now you can see that this also works perfectly fine. And again you can customize this. So let's say I want to start it with 10, I want to start it with 20. So you can see that these sort of things you can do. So whatever, as you can see right now, that whatever we were able to do with hierarchical components, we are now able to do with render props also. Now, it's not that render props and hierarchical components are like two mutually exclusive things. If you use one, then you cannot use other or something like that, right? You can mix and match. In fact, you can create hierarchical components using render props also. So, for example, let's say that I'm very much liking this sort of syntax, okay, and I want to do something like this only, which means that rather than doing like this, so let's remove two things, just let's keep one thing. So rather than doing something like this, I I want to use hierarchical component like this only. So let's create a hierarchical component where if I wrap that with something like this, then I should be able to use whatever I used earlier. So earlier I used to do something like this, like let's say this hello world or something, okay. Now I want to use a similar pattern. So what I can do is that I can comment this, because now I want to use this kind of pattern where I want to do this sort of thing inside a hierarchical component. So what I can do is that I can create a hierarchical component. Hierarchical component is what? Simply a function which takes a component as input, okay, and then what it does is that it returns another component. So let's return a new component. Let's return a new component, and that component uses this kind of pattern. So this kind of pattern, rather than using here, we can use it here, okay. So yeah, and now let's remove this for now. We can reuse it later, but right now I'm just showing you that simple case that what I have done is that I have a my div component, right? This normal div. I'm trying to render it with this text hello world. Now this my div thing is not normal. Now it has been wrapped with border, which means that now it will come here, and then it, rather than hard coding this, I have to use here. This dot props dot text, and then you can see that it works here also, okay. So you can see that this pattern is essentially like higher order component pattern, right? Now higher order component pattern I'm using, but inside the higher order component you can see that I'm using render props. So this render prop is being passed with the exact text prop which I am passing directly from here, that is being used here and directly rendered here. Oh, and since we are okay, so we should use rather this component rather than hard coding it here, because we already have the component, right? So whatever component we are passing it from here, so my div, we have to use that component rather than hard coding it ourselves, okay. So whatever this component is there, just our purpose is that to transparently pass whatever the props are getting passed here. So what we can do here is that we can simply take this and spread our this dot props, okay. So this thing works fine. And now we want to use, let's say, state also, what we earlier deleted. So how do we use state? So we know that in this render function count is already passed. So in this render function count is already passed, and then I can use this, right? I can use it like this, let's say. So yeah, this has to be in some span or something. Yeah, because it has to be one. So let's use something like this. So this should work, okay. And just put a space here. So yeah, it works, isn't it? And in a similar manner, now you can use multiple of them. That is fine, exactly in the same pattern. And now if you want to change, let's say, starting points, then what to do? Then yeah, you can use similar things like here here you can pass something like starting anything. So start is equal to, I don't know, 10, and then you can use that value inside inside this higher order component. So in this higher order component you will have this, and then you can use this count, this dot props dot, because the pattern has changed, right? So start, since the pattern has changed, and then in the second one it will be nan, because it has to be, if it is not there then it has to be 0. Okay, so essentially you got the idea that whatever we were doing earlier, that kind of thing can be mixed and matched and used with so you can see that clearly right now I'm back into higher order component pattern, but internally it is using essentially render props only. Okay, yeah, but yeah, that's fine, but let's keep our thing simple, because we essentially we are focusing here on render props. So rather than doing this, we will keep doing our normal thing rather than doing, yeah. So yeah, this should work. Okay, so yeah, I lost the props. Okay, so this has to be whatever the text you want. Yeah. So now we can see that we can use both of them in conjunction also, but right now we are just focusing on the scenario where we are using just render props in isolation. Now the next thing is that so one thing you see that this, so let's focus on just one rendering. So you can see that yeah, this thing is fine, but every time this component renders, what happens? Every time this component renders, then you are passing this as a prop, isn't it? This thing you are passing as a prop. What is this? This thing is a function. Okay, so what is happening that we discussed earlier also, that if you do something like this, then uh, this is as good as creating a new function every time, because on every render this inline function is created again and again. So this is as good as creating a separate variable, let's say something like this. Yeah, so const, let's say, render my div is equal to, and then you can say that actually it is as good as doing this, that you are creating every time a new function and passing it. So this is what is happening. You might sometimes you might not want to do something like this. Why? Because since every time a new function is created, this variable is changing every time, which means that this component will see that my this thing is changing every time. So yeah, in normal cases it is fine, it does not matter. But sometimes what happens that there is something called pure component, which we will discuss later, where rather than doing simple react.component, you use something called react.pure component. And it's like same as component, react.component. The only difference is that this re-renders only when there is some change in props or state. Okay, now you can see that there is a change in prop every time there is a change. So even if you have used pure component, you cannot get the advantage what you wanted here, because you know every time it is created again, and every time new memory location is created, this function is created again and again. So if you want to take advantage of that you cannot, because it is created again. So in that cases, what you can do is that rather than creating it like this, you can create a instance variable, something like this. You can create an instance variable, something like this. Let's say this dot render my div. sorry, it will be not this, because by default whenever you create at first level, that is a filled variable only. You don't need to, while creating, you don't need to use this, but when you are using, then you can simply use like this. Okay, now it works exactly like before, but the difference now is that this function, while this was created the first time, this thing is used and this thing is created, and after that this thing is never changing. After that, whenever re-rendering is happening, then also every time the same function is being used rather than creating it again and again. So yeah, that is fine. So but let's say here you are trying to use something which is like let's say some, I don't know, like some state is there inside this component also, and you are trying to get a closure of that. So in that cases, and anyways, you will need those sort of things here. So in that case, this will not work. You will have to do something like this in that case. Okay, so yeah, if that is the case, then there is no point in doing whatever I just said you. There's no point in doing this, and in that way, in that case, you don't need even pure component. Simply React.component is the thing which you are going to use. Anyways, React.purecomponent we are definitely going to read separately in some other video, but I just given you a highlight that sometimes while you are using render props, that kind of thing might not render in the way it is expected, and that the reason is that in render props, when you are doing something like this, then every time a new function is created altogether. Okay, so as I already said that this render name, this name, if you change, then essentially you have to change here also. Okay, so as I said that if you simply use, let's say, ABC here, then you can use here ABC. Okay, and that will also work perfectly fine. Now if I can use any name, can't I use children also? So let's use children. If you remember that, yeah, and you can just check that this also works exactly like that. But now you can, if you remember that children is a special prop, where children is actually whatever. So let's say if this thing would have been something like this. So let's see if this thing would be used something like this, then whatever you pass here, that thing is children. Okay, so whatever you pass here, that thing is children, isn't it? That is a special prop, whatever. So let's say you pass here span or whatever. But now in this case, I'm trying to pass this thing as a function. So what I can do is that I can use exactly this syntax, with the slight difference is that what I can do is that I can use something like this. The whole children thing, I can put it here. Okay, so this and this both are exactly the same. So this is a component, inside that this thing is inserted, and that's why whatever is inserted within the tags, that thing will become children. So that will be passed as children prop. Here specifically you are writing children prop and passing there. React will consider both of them exactly the same, and that's why you will see that both are working exactly the same. So the point is that some place, if you exactly use some other name, then obviously you can use here any other name. But if you are using children, then you can directly rather than passing children prop, you can actually do something like this also, and this will also work fine. If you remember that this sort of syntax we already saw somewhere, where it was in when we were learning about React context. In React context, obviously at the time of a provider in the root component, we wrapped it around a provider. But while we were consuming the context, then at the place of React context consumer, we had this syntax also, where if we had a React context consumer component there, here context was coming, remember? So that time I mentioned that this syntax is called render props, and we will discuss that later in some video. So this is a video where we're discussing render props, and that's why I just wanted to remind you that that was the syntax which was using exactly the same pattern where that was passed as a children prop. So definitely whatever the consumer component of React context is there, inside that definitely something like this they are internally implementing. Okay, so now you should fairly have a good idea that how that was working there. Yeah, so that should be it. This should be a good starting point for React render props. Yeah, so that should be all for this one. See you in the next video.